In our study of the Kena Upanishad, we have come to the last section of the text, the fourth chapter of the Kena, where it is revealed to the gods that that which came before them was the Brahman. And the result of this revelation is that the gods undergo a change. The verses that this covers, Sri Aurobindo puts in a chapter titled The Transfiguration of the Gods. Recall, the gods here are not only the powers working in the cosmos, but the same powers working in us, through our senses, through our mind, as our life energies, even in the formation of our body. These powers within us suddenly awaken to the fact that all that they have been doing so far was not theirs. All their success in what they have done is not their success, but the success of the Brahman whose power worked through them. This transition is crucial. It is a kind of an awakening to something which is greater than ourselves, which is yet ourselves. But while so far I thought I was doing and I am so great because of what I could do, now suddenly I become conscious that it was not I, but something greater than I. And yet it is I in a greater poise. Or rather, I who thought I was doing is a lesser reflection or limited expression of that which is the true I. And suddenly there is a shift in your sense of identity, but in your relation. Earlier you were not aware of it, or if you were aware, you saw it as separate, you saw no connection between you and that. Now you realize it is your own higher potential, your own higher capacity, the divine, not yourself, and yet you. What's the relationship that forms? Spontaneously one turns towards that, because we realize all of the greatness, all of the achievement, all of the victories are never yours, they are that working through you. And so the whole consciousness begins to turn upwards. And the passage described here, we look at verses 4 and 5 only. We read the translation first and then we will go deeper into it. Now this is the indication of that. As is this flash of the lightning upon us, or as is this falling of the eyelids, so in this which is of the gods. A very cryptic, very condensed statement. And then verse 5, then in that which is of the self. As the motion of this mind seems to attain to that, and by it afterwards the will in the thought continually remembers that. So just these two verses are what Sri Aurobindo has been elaborating in the text that we have been reading. The first idea, when the verse 4 says, now this is the indication of that. Sri Aurobindo discusses this transition. The recognition by the gods that all this is only an indication of that. And so he describes how the gods turn to offer themselves and begin to reflect that more and more consciously. They leave behind the false idea of an independent action, which is nothing but an egoism of the mind and life and the senses. They become consciously passive to the power, light and joy of something which is beyond themselves. What happens then is that in this divine, this divine unnameable reflects himself openly in the gods. His light takes possession of the thinking mind, his power and joy of the life. his light and rapture of the emotional mind and the senses. Something of the supreme image of the Brahman falls upon the world nature and changes it into the divine nature. So this is the transfiguration which the rest of the text elaborates in both in the Kena and in Sri Aurobindo's commentary. Now just this phrase, now this is the indication of that. The problem with translation is the English language does not convey the richness of the words and their subtle and multi-layered meaning. We have had occasion to mention this, that the Sanskrit language itself conveys in a single word a kind of a experiential content rather than a thought content. And this is the reason why a single word in Sanskrit will be listed in a dictionary with 20 words in English. Or a single word in English will have many Sanskrit words corresponding to it. Because it's not a one-to-one piece, idea matching idea. One side is a rich experiential content in the Sanskrit language, and in most of the modern languages, the words capture idea pieces. So they catch an aspect of the experience, and so the closest matching idea we throw in, but it's not complete. So another matching idea we throw in, and you have a list of English words, all circling around what is otherwise a single experiential punch. So in Sanskrit, tasyaisha adesho. Tasya, of that, esha, this, adesho. Sri Aurobindo has translated as indication. This is the indication of that. When you look at other translations or commentaries by many scholars, you will find they take the word adesha literally as it is understood in the modern mind. Remember, the modern mind has also drifted away from the intuitive content of the Sanskrit language, because the modern mind is used to now thinking in English or any other modern language which is idea based rather than experience based. And so adesha is the word used to say order, command. So they will translate this as, now this is the command of that, meaning that is commanding you. What? And suddenly the sentence makes no sense. Flash of lightning, falling of the eyelid, and the same in the gods. What does it mean? That is commanding you, flash of lightning, eyelids and gods? Doesn't make sense, you see. Because the word adesha has been misunderstood. Adesha, if you go to the etymology, the desha comes from the root disha, direction. Showing of the direction. But it's not just showing of the direction, it literally means turning into direction. What is a command? When an authority gives you a command, here is the order, do this. What is he doing? He's taking a consciousness and turning it into that direction. That's the nature of the experience which is transmitted. The word or the idea of command or authority is a piece. The content of the experience is a power that seizes you and turns you in a different direction or a specific direction. So adesha is this turning. Of that, this is the adesha. Now you see the meaning is very different. This is the indication of that. And Sri Aurobindo used the word indication. And the indication, the root again goes to indication, has this component of the direction, of orientation. This is the indication of that. In other words, this becomes the indicator of that. This aligns itself to reflect, to express that. Now there is repeatedly in the text the word iti, thus, thus, thus. 3 times it says that. And so Sri Aurobindo puts it in the translation as now. This is the indication of that. Why now? After, in the story. After this has happened, now this becomes the indication of that. When the gods awaken to, oh, that is the source of our victory, that is the power that was working through us, now this becomes the indication of that. You see the sense of it. And so, as you awaken to the source of your own victory, of your own strength, of your own knowledge, of your own life, of the perception of your senses, all is there, and from there it comes. Now this becomes the indication of that. And increasingly this turns to that. Except that this process is not immediate. And so comes these three stages. As is this flash of the lightning upon us, or as is this falling of the eyelid, or in that, so in that which is of the gods. In the Sanskrit, it takes this form. Yadetad vidyuto vyadyutada. Vidyut, lightning. Vyadyutada, lights up. So that this lightning lightens up would be the coarse literal translation. You have to see the sense of, again, the English word lightning gives you a picture of something in the sky. But if you see the Sanskrit word vidyut, it describes the nature of revelation. Literally would be the etymology of it. Vidyut, you will see the word vid is related to knowledge, understanding. Not knowledge in itself, but the understanding dawning. Veti is understanding. Vidyut, the same root, which is a flashed understanding, a flashed emergence of the understanding. And it does not say lightning flashes. In English, there are two different words. It says lightning lights up, lightning lightnings. Okay, so the perception of the knowledge becomes perceived. This would be the literal translation of this. So of that, the perception of knowledge becomes perceived. Now this is bad English, it's the literal translation, but it conveys better the mood of what the Sanskrit vocabulary gives as the experience of it. And of course in the translation, to make it a proper English sentence, as is this flash of the lightning upon us. That's how Sri Aurobindo translates. The next word, the next phrase, iti, thus, or as in, he says, iti anyamimishada. And the nimisha is this eye blinking. Or as is this falling of the eyelid, Sri Aurobindo translates, the blink, the wink. And then, similarly, iti, ityadhi daivatam, of the nature of the gods. Now, these three terms Sri Aurobindo has elaborated in the commentary in a way which makes not only eminent sense, but it describes this process of what happens when you turn to receive and to reflect the divine. He says all of this change to express divine nature, all this is not done by a sudden miracle. It comes by flashes, revelations, sudden touches and glimpses. There is as if a leap of the lightning of revelation flaming out from those heavens for a moment and then returning into its secret source. As if the lifting of the eyelid of an inner vision and it's falling again because the eye cannot look long and steadily on the utter light. This we have dwelt upon last time in great detail, where we concentrated on the nature of this revelation of the lightning, looking also at the physical symbolism of the lightning process itself and how it descends and withdraws. We also spoke last time about what happens when the eyelid of the inner vision opens, and the distinction between the surface vision, mind's vision, and the inner vision. So we do not repeat that. But having taken that, we see how, what more the Sanskrit text conveys to us. As the lightning lights up, this is one aspect. The other is the falling of the eyelid in the winking. And the suggestion, when you read the pure Sanskrit term, it's not the physical wink, not the physical eye closing, but nimisha has also the sense of momentary, a tiny moment of time. So the sense is not just the eye blink, but at the same time the blink is a measure of time, in a moment that it comes. So the suggestion here is equally of time as much as the perception unable to hold. When first there is the reflection of the divine consciousness in us, like the lightning, it comes, it withdraws, but also in our own consciousness, it is in a moment and it does not last. Primarily because when that first happens, you will see the response in your mind. The insight comes, I've got it. You rush into activity. What comes, you do not wait to catch and receive in whole. The moment it comes, your mind leaps up and gets excited and blocks the experience itself. Mother refers to this as a necessity for the training of the mind, that when an intuition comes, rather than leaping and jumping to catch the form or give it form, you should wait quietly, in passivity. Wait for that to settle of its own accord. Wait for that to unfold and reveal and take its own form. And when you do that, you will see the intuition comes almost like a packet of knowledge, a bundle of light of knowledge. And it starts unfolding, it starts revealing layer by layer, and in a complex knowledge. And sometimes it takes the material of your mind, the existing content which you have, and aligns it around this light. The things which you know in pieces are now suddenly fitting around this center. Things you had forgotten are actually called out from your memory and made to fit into this insight. And suddenly it falls into a clear, lit up awareness. What was earlier pieces of knowledge or memories form into a complete experience, of which these memories and knowledge are aspects, facets. And it is multi-layered, even as it continues. So the training of the mind to remain quiet, to remain passive to the intuition that comes, to allow the intuition to use the mind and to unfold itself fully, is a critical part of the development of this higher knowledge. Sri Aurobindo, in his chapter on the intuitive mind in the Synthesis of Yoga, describes 4 methods by which this capacity of the intuition and its free action in us can be developed. And the first method is training the mind to become silent, to remain silent at will for as long as required. So you should be able to make the mind silent and stay silent as long as you need. Once this capacity develops, everything else becomes easier. The second method he describes is shifting the center of your awareness from inside the brain, center of head, to above head, bringing it closer to the center of intuition in our subtle body, so that we receive not by a distant reflection, but we receive in a consciousness which itself approaches the source. So the gap is less, and we are able to receive and be molded by the intuition's touch directly, rapidly, more completely. The third method, he says, is when initiating any work, rather than doing it, you wait. Wait for the intuition to enter and initiate you, or your energy or your will, into the activity. Now, this you will see brings it most into the domain of action, where the earlier stages were more in the domain of knowledge. Here it is the intuition which initiates the action with its content not only of knowledge but also of will. And for this, you see what is happening, the full passivity, not only of your container of knowledge in the mind's reflective state of silence, but also in your vehicle of action, the state of passivity that allows something greater than you to lead and guide the movement. Now, when you take it to this degree, the passivity has acquired two aspects, knowledge as well as action. But it is a receptive passivity for both. At first, though, when it touches, there is this reaction and it can only stay for a moment. Increasingly, by repeated touches, your mind learns to become more quiet, more passive, more receptive. Until now, this can come and the mind stays without getting restless. And then what descends can stay and the mind receive. And the merging of the two takes place more and more until it can flow into action. So, as is this flash of the lightning upon us, or as this falling of the eyelids, the wink, the moment, this is the indication of that. So, Sri Aurobindo's commentary, you see how he takes this. The repetition of these touches and visitings from the beyond fixes the gods in their upward gaze and expectation. Constant repetition fixes them in a constant passivity. Not moving out any longer to grasp at the forms of the universe, mind, life and senses will more and more be fixed in the memory, in the understanding, in the joy of the touch and vision of that transcendent glory, which they have now resolved to make their sole object. To that only they will learn to respond, and not to the touches of outward things. The silence which has fallen on them, and which is now foundation and status, will become their knowledge of the eternal silence, which is the Brahman. The response of their functioning to a supernal light, power and joy will become their knowledge of the eternal activity, which is the Brahman. So both sides, the silence of the Brahman, which then reflects in the knowledge, and then the activity of the Brahman, which reflects in their activity. Now you see, in this description, he has encapsulated in just a few sentences, the whole process by which the lower consciousness is trained to receive and become a conscious vehicle, an instrument for the higher consciousness. Through the repetition of these touches and visitings, there is this change which takes place. And so in the text you will now see the third item, so in that which is of the gods. As in the flash of the lightning, as in the falling of the eyelids, so in that which is of the gods. So this is almost like an example for what must happen in the consciousness of the working of the gods in us. Now the term used, iti adhi daivatam, adhi of the nature of the character of, daivatam, gods. Again, you have to go into the root etymology. Deva, God, literally means the same root as div, light, diya. So it literally means light, being, light content, light form. The word God in English is it's not at all fitting in this. It digresses from the whole sense of Deva. Deva literally brings in your mind the idea of being of light, a form of light, revealing. When you put God, you see a figure, a face, an object which is worshipped in some temple, or something floating, flying, person. And it completely warps the sense of Deva. Unfortunately, there is no other word in English, so we have to stay with that. That's why it's so important to get into the Sanskrit and the etymology, and you get behind the limitation of the English language. As in this flash of the lightning, in the falling of the eyelids, so in the Deva. Now you see the meaning it gives? It's very different. So in this light form working in us. The same process, the same movement. So within us, the Devas, the light beings, the light energies, are these powers which are working. It is the working of the gods, Devas in us, which makes for the working of the sight. It is that working which sees. It is that working which brings the life force. It's that working which makes the mind move, work, see, cognize, perceive. It's that working in the body which keeps the body what it is, giving it the form, regenerating, repairing, forming, holding and developing the form. So in that which is of the Devas, there is the same movement, the flash of the light, the falling of the eyelids, as this is the indication of that. Now the moment we hear the word Adhidaiva, of the nature of the gods, we are reminded of another similar word which is very closely associated with this, Adhyatma, Adhi Atman, of the nature of Atman. I will briefly, for those who are not familiar, remind you that in the Vedic tradition, the text of the Veda is described as something which can be understood on three levels. Adhibhautik, of the nature of the Bhuta, Adhidaivik, of the nature of the Deva, Adhyatman, of the nature of the Atman. So translating it now, it will be of the nature of the five elements, Bhutani, five elements, of the nature of the light beings, light forces, Deva, of the nature of Atman, which is the divine essence. So there are three levels on which the same text can be understood. At the level of the five elements which form matter, which become rigid formed object. At the level of the essential forces which drive and guide these forms. And then at the level of the Atman, which is eternal, infinite, one, that supports, holds all of this, but holds also the essential reality behind these forces and forms. So on three levels that you can perceive and understand the same text. But what it does is, it reminds us that there is a continuity across these three domains of experience. In everything that happens, and we come back to our example of the flower, there is the form of the flower, its molecular and atomic structure, which would be the adhibhautik, of the formed five elements. And behind that adhidaivik will be the divine, the godly powers, the light forces, which glow out through the flower, which maintain, sustain, and express. And then behind that is the Atman, the divine, eternal, supporting, informing, and expressing itself through these two layers of phenomena. All three are simultaneous. Depending on where we live in our consciousness and in our perception, we see that more than the others. So a normal human being looks at the flower, oh yeah, it looks pretty. So many petals, so many colors, yeah, this is nice, it's not damaged. Oh, there's no brown spot, yes, this I can sell. The brown spot, I can't sell, I throw it away. You've stopped with the first layer. Or if your deeper heart is open, you say, oh, this is so beautiful. I don't feel like throwing it away. Even if I can't sell, I'm going to keep it for myself. Because you feel something deeper. Or there is that experience where you look at the flower and you see within it the divine. You have the example in the life of certain saints, Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He looked up and saw the flying swans and he fell in a swoon of bliss. Oh, such a beautiful experience. He looked at a boy, cowherd with the cows, leaning against the tree, and he saw Krishna and went into a blissful state. In each form, one can thus perceive that behind who chooses the form as one of its many means of expression in the play. And so, depending on where we live in our consciousness, we register that more. But even if we are not conscious and we are superficial, something on the inner layers is there. Because it's there, it senses, but it's not conscious and cannot appreciate fully. As we awaken in our consciousness deeper and more completely, as we grow in our consciousness, we perceive that in all things. And this is what is happening here. As the gods in us, they awaken to that which is behind the gods. They begin to reflect that, they grow, they perceive more deeply, they see and enjoy more profoundly what? That which is being revealed through the form. So, the repetition of these touches and visitings from the beyond fixes the gods in their upward gaze and expectation. Oh, more of this. But I was saying these three terms, Adhidaivik, and immediately it reminds us of the Adhyatman, of the nature of the Atman. And here the sentence stops. So in that which is of the gods. And so you say, well, the message is not complete until you see the next sentence, which begins with, so in that of the self. And the text Sri Aurobindo translates as, then in that which is of the self. Adhyatmanam. And then the thing is complete. So the sentence itself, the verse continues into the next verse. But there's a pause here because first in the gods this must come. And then in the self, in our own consciousness, we begin to awaken to that. So there are two things happening in us. The gods awaken to the divine, and then our own consciousness awakes to that. So again we connect this to an earlier part of the Kena text when it said, you cannot know the divine directly. The first thing you have to do, he says, that of it which is you, that of it which is in the gods. This you have to think out. That's when you begin to know that. So there was always this double aspect. You, as an awareness, must know that which is in you. And then the movement in your nature, in your personality, in the movement of the gods within you and even in the universe, in that you must see what of that is in the gods. Okay? And the gods are awakening to that, you also have to awaken to that. So the verse 5 starts with, then in that which is of the self. And then what happens? These two things join. As the motion of this mind seems to attain to that. First step. And by it afterwards, the will in the thought continuously remembers that. So first the mind turns again and again. And through the repetition, something of the memory remains. And because the memory remains, the will turns. More of this, more of this. And so this three-step process he is describing, and we will reread this text. The repetition of these touches and visitings from the beyond fixes the gods in their upward gaze and expectations. Constant repetition fixes them in a constant passivity. Not moving out any longer to grasp at the form of the universe, mind, life and sense will more and more be fixed in the memory, in the understanding, in the joy of the touch and vision of that transcendent glory which they have now resolved to make their sole object. So having glimpsed in the flower the first time, oh, there's this extraordinary presence and beauty. Afterwards, when I look at another flower, if I don't feel that, oh, something is missing, I want that experience which I got. And I strive for it. I don't know how to get it. At first there is this disturbance, agitation. And then when I let go, I give up, suddenly it comes again. And I realize every time I am agitated, it screens. Every time I am quiet, silent, receptive, passive, it reveals itself. And then I learn. So the repetition is important to teach this to the movement of the gods, which are still too egoistic, self-motivated, self-driven, and they learn to become passive. And now I take the flower and I wait until gradually it emerges. I remember what I felt, what I saw, and I wait for it, I yearn for it, I aspire. They have resolved to make their sole object that. To that only they will learn to respond, and not to the touches of outward things. We may take another analogy here, and I will narrate an incident which is revealing of the nature of this approach. I've said it many times, it's worth repeating here. When I had gone to Gujarat, one of my first trips there, I was taken to meet the head of a spiritual community. It was a bhakti, devotional community, and the head and the disciples lived in one building, which was their ashram. The disciples had their own rooms. Each one of them was working in some job in the city. One of them was a vice chancellor, very senior in position and authority, but here he lived as a sadhaka. He had no sense of self-importance or power or authority. He was just doing his service. And the Guru lived in the same building and they served him also. And so when I met him, he said to me, "Oh, you are from the Sri Aurobindo ashram. I have been there once and I learnt a very important lesson." And then he narrated his story. He said, "When I went there, I saw everybody working. The mother is in her room and everybody is working in their activities, in their departments, services. But then I asked them, how are you doing sadhana? Because as far as I understand, you cannot do sadhana unless you are serving the Guru. In their particular tradition, it takes a physical form that you go and wash the feet of the Guru, you do some work for him, sweep the floor of his room, whatever form it may take." So I said, "How are you doing sadhana if you're doing your work here and your Guru is sitting in her room?" So the person who was leading him around was one Sundaram. He was a Gujarati poet, unusual man. And he said to him, "Oh, let me explain." He asked, "Have you ever had the experience of falling in love?" So this man said, "Yes." He said, "When you fall in love, then you only think of the beloved. And so all of us here in the ashram, we have fallen in love with the mother. And so whatever work we do, we are only thinking of her. We see her everywhere and we work for her only." And then this man said, "Then I understood. It made a lot of sense." I said, "Yes, now I understand your sadhana." So the idea was, it's not that you physically enter in the space of the Guru and serve his physical form. Whatever you may do, wherever you are, as long as in consciousness you dwell on the divine, you're serving divine. And that becomes your sadhana service. But this I'm pointing to because this is what is described here or indicated here when they say, "To that only they will learn to respond and not to the touches of outward things." What does that mean? When I pick up the flower, how can I say I'm not touching the outward things? But where is my consciousness? On the divine, of which the flower is the form. On the divine, which reveals itself as beauty through the flower. And I am obsessed with, in love with the divine. And although I am handle the outer forms of things, each form and to each action, it isn't my whole consciousness. So you understand it in that sense. Not moving out any longer to grasp at the forms of the universe, mind, life and senses will more and more be fixed in the memory, in the understanding, in the joy of the touch and vision of that transcendent glory, which they have now resolved to make their sole object. So, all three levels: mind, life, and senses. So, your mind turns to the divine, your life energies and your emotions and your heart turns, and then even in the senses, when you see each object, you begin to sense the thing behind. Now, this you will recall when we discussed last time the opening of the inner sight. We discussed how there are many degrees even in which that can happen, and the deeper the sight goes in its source, the more profoundly it sees in things. And when the sight approaches the station of the inmost soul, it sees also the inmost soul in all things, in all beings, even in all objects. You look at the earth and you see Mother Earth as a conscious being, as a divine being even. You look at a stone and you see in that a divine presence. In some, the soul of the stone is formed, in some it is not so formed. You look at a mountain, in some mountains you feel vividly this presence of a being, in some it is less developed, less formed. And so on with all things. But you're seeing that first because the source of your sight is there. The other things are there, but somehow they are not so important, or they are at best a support for this perception to happen. So all three things, not moving out any longer to grasp at the forms of the universe. Instead of saying, this is volcano, I say, oh, this is this divine being. When you go to most of the old cultures, you'll find this so common. It's not there in the common man. It is there in their elite, in their, let's say, spiritual leaders, in their shamans. They too perhaps may see or sense only in certain altered states. But the truth of it is registered there and is vivid and important enough that they do not look at that mountain as just a pile of mud and rock. They see the conscious being. They relate to it, and they even have a dialogue, a conversation with it. When that same spontaneous process acquires a more formal character, it often gets mixed up. I was in Japan once, and we had a healer, medicine man, teacher, whatever name you give to it, chief, as they call themselves, from the African tradition. So he was there, and we were supposed to approach Mount Fuji, except there was a thick layer of cloud, we could never see the mountain. But we were at the foot of the mountain. And so I asked him, can you feel the mountain? Can you communicate with it? He looked at it for a while, and then he told me, I am a chief of my territory. Now I have come into another territory. I have to take permission of the chief here before I can communicate. That sounded to me too bureaucratic. So I said to him, well, can't you ask the mountain if it's all right for you to communicate with him? He looked, he smiled, and you understand very deeply. But I found it surprising because in the tradition as it was transmitted, from what was earlier a spontaneous perception, it had become now, there's a whole, let's say, the social aspect to it, which has been built around, you must, in order to respect, in order to show respect, you must first take permission, you must do this, you must do that. And that's how all the processes around royalty also form. In order to protect what is first perceived, that it may not become too diluted, that you may lose respect, you go through all these kinds of conventions. And their tradition had already slipped into those conventional forms. But there was a time before this conventional phase, in the period we call the Satya Yuga, where the perception and the relation was spontaneous. And as the decline in humanity took place, the spontaneous perception had to be protected and the conventions were built up, which led to the second phase of the 4 yuga cycle. And in the 4th yuga, of course, the conventions are all broken, you have only chaos and complete loss of the perception itself. Mountain is just a pile of rubble and stone. Let's go dig it and extract the iron ore or uranium ore or whatever it is you're craving for. It's just in terms of value. When the US invaded Afghanistan, very quickly a report came out that the mineral worth in Afghanistan's mountains was more than $1 trillion. And I said, oops, now they're just going to go and literally rip out the earth with no sense of what those mountains represent or their consciousness. It's almost like killing a being. Whereas the old cultures would say, oh, we must take permission of the mountain. And sometimes the mountain will willingly give what you need. Or even it will allow you, if you ask, well, it will allow you to dig into it. A tree may voluntarily say, all right, take my body, take my life, because that's my way of serving your need. Or it may say, no, I'm not yet ready. And some other tree will say, I'm ready. Again, the memory comes of another. I had occasion to meet with somebody from the Eskimo tradition as a chief in that tradition. We were on the west coast of the USA. He had this big drum that he came with, and he said he used to communicate with and call the, what's that animal, which, sea lions, I think, yes. And on that coast there are many of those. And he said, I can call them. And he explained how, in their tradition, because living as Eskimos, they have no plant. The only food they have is meat. And so they have to ask for these, they have to kill and eat from these sea lions, I think. And so, what do you call it? Sea? No, the long, seals, the seals, yes, the seals. So they have to eat from them. There's nothing else left. You cannot grow anything. So what do? And he said, one seal will feed an entire family for a week. So we go to the shore and we call to them and we say, we need food, we are hungry. And the family comes forward and one person will crawl out and offer itself to be eaten. It's so moving. And it will give itself happily because it's its way of serving in its relationship with humanity. And of course they will also kill it as gently as possible and so on. But they will never go out to massacre and kill for the sake of whatever profit or just the perverse pleasure of doing it. In the English language, the word game is actually used to describe the killing of animals for the fun, for the pleasure. So they will go out and shoot and kill birds and animals and say, this is game. The animal is game. Fair game. Meaning I can kill it because I am capable of, so it's fair game. In certain parts in the Pacific, they gather dolphins in the thousands and butcher them. Why? Because they want to extract the fat from the dolphin or the whales for sale. But the whole experience is done in such a crude and coarse manner. You're just butchering an entire species. Quite different from this. I'm only highlighting this to show you how the awakened consciousness in man relates to those same beings under the same circumstances. It sees they're a living being. And then the relationship changes completely. Here we are going even deeper. The whole perception moves to something deeper, to that which is the divine in all things. To that only they will learn to respond and not to the touches of outward things. So I made this digression to point out this deeper perception did exist, was normal for humanity in its higher or more awakened phase. We have passed through a downward cycle and are on the cusp of a new awakening. Increasingly, Sri Aurobindo points out, there will be this transition to a more subjective perception. And it's already happening. Where people value not so much the surface appearance and the surface values, but a deeper subjectivity. This is valuable because I feel it's important for me. This was given by my grandmother. It may have no commercial value, but it's more valuable for me than something for which I would spend a lot of money. That is now acquiring greater importance. And the experience is more important than the financial worth of it. And this whole shift is taking place rapidly, especially in the last 20 years, with the failure of science, with this failure of rationality and its promises to make life perfect. It has failed. Modernism has failed, and there's a post-modern passage which is subjective. But Sri Aurobindo points to the error of subjectivism, which is to stop short with your emotions and the vital ego. I feel this, and so I will do it. And you're only putting yourself at risk under the impulsion and source of a deeper, less reliable, impulsive center of consciousness. This would be the false subjectivism, where the ego, the inner vital or mental ego, takes charge. And if we can bypass this, not stop short and go deeper, we would come to the true subjectivity of the soul. And this is a passage which is risky, which is dangerous. If you stop short there, then you would be at the level of the gods, feeling themselves powerful, and we are the source, our victory is what matters. The passage beyond the gods, where gods awaken and say, oh, our joy, our success is sourced in that. And the false subjectivism, or the ego of the false subjectivism, gives in to the true subjectivism of the soul. That would be this transition. So this description is so valuable because it is literally what is necessary today in humanity in our current phase of evolution. The first step was to get to a subjectivism, but after that, this subjectivism partial has to give in to the true. So to that only they will learn to respond, and not to the touches of outward things. But how do you know what is that? What is this true subjectivism? And that's why the initial process is through these flashes. And the flashes have to come again and again. Repetition of these touches and visitings from the beyond fixes the gods in their upward gaze and expectation. This is what is needed in humanity today. More and more of those moments where people feel, perceive something deeper, truer, which reminds you that all that we are today in our best is nothing compared to what is waiting for us, which is so much more beautiful, so much more satisfying. So the joy of the touch and vision of that transcendent glory. And that process having happened a few times, comes the memory of it. Now because I remember those beautiful moments, this is not acceptable, it's not enough. And the memory is the second stage. And the third stage is when the will says, I must make the effort to get to that. And so that they have now resolved to make their soul's object. To that only they will learn to respond, and not to the touches of outward things. This is now when the resolution has been made, we fixate ourselves only on that. This is the single most important thing in my life. All the other things, I've been there, done that, they were good, they were great in their time and place. Now I must dedicate myself to this, which is so much more valuable and complete. The silence which has fallen on them, and which is now their foundation and status, will become their knowledge of the eternal silence, which is Brahman. So now this takes a double form. The stillness settling in you opens out to the silence of the Brahman, and the knowledge of that silence settles in you. And the second facet, the response of their functioning to a supernal light, power, joy, will become their knowledge of the eternal activity, which is Brahman. So when there is this light, power and joy which come from above, and their functioning now participates and expresses this light and power and joy, they share in the active aspect of Brahman. So there is a double awakening in the silence, which holds the knowledge of the silence of Brahman, and the activity which manifests, not just reflects, the power, the light, power and joy of the Brahman. Other status, other response and activity, they will not know. The mind will know nothing but the Brahman, think nothing but the Brahman. The life will move to embrace, enjoy nothing but the Brahman. The eye will see, the ear will hear, the other senses sense nothing but the Brahman. And so this brings us to that poise which was described by Sundaram. All of us are in love with the Divine Mother. And so everything we do is only seeing her, feeling her, serving her. And that's when the identity, the identification becomes more and more complete, and the divine inspiration becomes more and more clear, direct and revealed. So we'll pause here. The next paragraph he takes up. Does this mean it is a complete oblivion from the external? Do the senses and mind turn inward to the divine, or is there also a perception of the divine which is now expressed? There are two choices, in fact. You can choose to withdraw in this perception, or you can choose to fulfill in this. And this we will discuss in the next session. But for now, this is the status, this is the poise brought about by a series of repetitions. If you look back at the big picture of our journey, across lives, we have had these series of contacts. And across lives, there is a build-up of a memory. And so in this life, you realize somehow something is missing. There is something more which I am supposed to perceive and experience. And memory comes because of the preparation built up across lives. And if the inner being is sufficiently developed across those lives, it already turns, I need to search for that. It's been my experience looking at across different cultures in the world, looking at the young people, not all, but many, and increasingly more. You find them restless, dissatisfied, seeking, but they are not conscious of what they are seeking. And the result is they end up losing their way. If the memory is strong enough, in some it is so, then they're conscious that they're seeking something more which they are unable to get with the current patterns of life. And such people then start going to spiritual discourses or taking up certain spiritual practices or going to spaces which for them represent the spirituality and so on. And so you see this phase happening not only within the journey of an individual, but also in the collective evolution of humanity, where the repeated passages combined with the current crisis is forcing people to look further. And when that becomes more and more frequent, when the memory becomes more formed, then this will also will align and give itself more and more exclusively. And this is what the verse 5 says. Then in that which is of the self, as the motion of this mind seems to attain to that, and by it afterwards the will in the thought continually remembers it. So in two very simple verses, very cryptic, very condensed, the text reveals this whole turn of the consciousness and the knowledge of this awakening and the transformation of the gods. But what is the result of this passage? And I read the next verse, which we will have time to elaborate later. The name of that is that delight. As that delight, one should follow after it. He who so knows that, towards him verily all existences yearn. And this will bring us to a new dimension. The divine essentially is the delight. And our journey of life is one recovering of that delight which was our origin, but also which is the manifestation that we have to bring into this world. And towards Him all existences yearn, because that's the whole goal of the universe. To put it in more formed terms, we will say the whole universe has been moving forward in this evolutionary struggle to glimpse and to manifest the divine delight more and more. And we as human beings are the focal points, the frontal edges of this awakening in the universe, through which the universe hopes to build that bridge to manifest the delight in the cosmos. You can meditate on this for a moment.